Okay. Um, so this is a reprise of a session that we did, I think initially 8 years ago. And the purpose behind it was to look at in detail what happens when somebody immigrated in the Ellis Island period, typically from Eastern Europe or Ireland or Italy through Ellis Island. You know, you start off with the idea, oh, well, they went through Ellis Island. Well, wait a minute. How did they get to Ellis Island? Where did the money come from to do this? How did someone, and we'll be looking today at a family that is leaving Lithuania. Okay, so we're up northeastern of Poland and ends up in Lynn, Massachusetts. How did that happen? It wasn't like, you know, you sort of said to your local AAA agent, you know, let's do this. So, um, so what happened? In 1891, we went from a point where instead of immigration being managed by the Customs Department, it was managed by the Immigration Service. We created an Office of Immigration. And what was happening was similar to what's happening today, where we had a lot of immigrants coming in and there were no controls. That act explicitly excluded most Asians. I'm sure you all have come across the term Asian Exclusion Act. Historically, ship manifests were always required. In other words, when a ship came in, it was supposed to have a list of all the passengers. That was typically, somewhat garbagey. You know, you could do it or not do it, and if you did it, you didn't have to be terribly exact. Now it had to be exact. They added a requirement that all immigrants had to be healthy and potentially able to work. Okay, and safeguards were set in place to protect the immigrants. Prior to that, it was not unusual for an immigrant to get off of a boat and hit the dock, and immediately somebody would come to them and say, "Oh, let me change your money for you." Uh-huh. And you can imagine what the rate was that they would get, you know. Or if you were a woman and all by yourself, let me help you find a place to live. Oopsie. Okay. And so real safeguards were set in place. They were quite serious. Up until then, at Castle Garden, which was at the end of Battery Park, if you know Manhattan, was the place they came in. Instead, they took this island that was out in the middle of the bay and created Ellis Island. Well, Ellis Island's the name of it. 12 million Europeans came through Ellis Island. What we'll learn today is immigration was a business. It was a big business. It was driven by America's industrial economy, which wanted low-wage workers, and German steamships, which had been built to carry immigrants. Most immigrants had their way paid by someone who lived in America, usually a relative, and you'll see why as we talk about it. Chain migration is the primary way people move around anyway. People don't just suddenly decide they're going to pick up and go someplace. They usually go someplace where they know people. And few immigrants ever left home without a clear destination. Many, and we'll talk about the numbers, many immigrants actually returned to their home country, surprisingly. And finally, if you walk away with one thing from today, it's to know that virtually no one had their name changed at Ellis Island. That did not happen. You'll see why. So our story today begins in August 1902. We're in Lynn, Massachusetts. This is the General Electric plant. Okay. There are chairs in the other room are available here. So we're going to be working with Isidor Kotkovsky, who is my wife's grandfather. He immigrated in April 1901 from Vilnius, which is Vilnius, at that time Vilna, Russia, which is now Vilnius, Lithuania. And he came to live with his cousin Michael, who encouraged him to come to Massachusetts to find work. He worked for General Electric, saved money to pay for his wife and brother to come to the United States. So our story starts by his going to the local office of the steamship line, where he arranges to buy those tickets. So the cost of a through ticket from Lithuania through to Lynn was about $40 US. At that time, Isidore's job probably paid $10 a week. The commercial rate for work in Lithuania was $1 a week. So he would have been living probably in a boarding house with a lot of other single men, saving money. So in addition to the ticket, he would have arranged to send money. Tickets would be bought in America and then delivered at the home country. And money was remitted through Wells Fargo. They had a service internationally, and U.S. postal money orders. Sometimes the steamship company would do it, and sometimes there was a home country bank that would do it. So the political reason this all happened was our economy needed healthy workers. We needed people to work in factories like the GE factory, and we needed people to work in the mines. So your family came over, they are quite likely that the men were coming over to work in a factory, classic, or in the mines. So this would be a Polish couple. This is actually a picture of a Polish couple in Ellis Island. And imagine these as the two people we're going to talk about. This is Isidore's brother and his wife, Milena. This is the kind of dwelling they would probably have lived in Poland. So this is where we start. This is a flyer that would have been posted in Poland telling people, hey, don't you want to go to America? And this is all sorts of things about how to do it. The steamship companies had built ships designed to bring 1,200, 1,500 immigrants in steerage. And we'll talk about those ships later. Okay. And their business was filling the ships full. So they would sell tickets, usually, not usually, more often in the US than at the home location, but whichever. Okay. This is a kind of ticket. Okay. This is someone showing the money that they paid to go from Hamburg to McKeesport. Okay. We'll talk a little bit about that later. And this is a receipt for money that was transmitted. Because if you think about it, in addition to having to pay for the transportation, this couple is going to have to eat. They're going to have extra expenses. They're going to have to, you know, as they go from Lithuania to the United States. But is it sort of clear now? This was a business. Okay. Very well organized, very well structured. So this is what they did. They would have gone from Anuskas, which is the village they came from, to the big city Vilnius, probably by horse cart. Okay, in Vilnius, they'd have gotten a train that would have taken them to Warsaw, okay, then to Poznan, on to Berlin, and on to Bremen. One of the reasons this worked was because in addition to the classic first, second, and third class train affairs, the train systems in Europe at this point had a fourth class. It was an immigrant class. The tickets were typically sold only to immigrants, and the 1,400-mile trip from Vilnius to Bremerhaven would have cost $5. Okay, if you could kind of imagine that, that's semi-crazy. So you would have had a customs check. Customs checks were, you know, they were somewhat nasty. We'll talk about the situation for Jewish immigrants later because there were some specific issues for Jewish immigrants. But for a typical immigrant, you got there, you had to be, you got out of your train, you were inspected. If you had a ticket from one of the agencies, there would be an agent at the ticket, at the customs office. They would come on out, they'd make sure you got through okay. They'd explain to you what was going on, what would happen at the next stop, etc. So you actually, one of the services that was provided was to have someone at the border who would help you get through. So you went on to Bremerhaven. Typically, it would take about 4 weeks from Vilnius to Lynn, Massachusetts, and going across Europe was about 10 days. When you arrived in Bremerhaven, your steamship company, in this case it's the Norddeutscher Lloyd, your steamship company had regular boats going back and forth. You were not pre-booked onto a specific boat. They had facilities where you could stay. You would stay, and they were reported to have been very good. They did not cost anything. They were holding you for the next ship. And then you got on the next ship and off you went. Before you left, you had to go through an inspection. And that was when the question of whether you were fit to go to America was really reached. About 5% of the people got turned back at the border, but about 8% of the people got turned back by the steamship company. Why didn't the steamship company want to take them? Well, if you went to New York and you were rejected by American immigrants, the steamship company had to pay a $100 fine and take you back to Europe. Okay, so it was in their interest to make sure that you were healthy and you were ready to meet all the requirements to get into the United States. So let's take the ship. Oh, before we do that, this is the manifest. If you've ever been able to research your own family if they came over, you found a manifest that lists on the left-hand side the names of all the people, information about who they were, what their language was, where they were going. Okay, a lot of specific information. This was filled out by a ship's officer in Bremerhaven. So the name that your ancestor came into the United States with was the name that the ship's officer wrote on this piece of paper. When you got to Ellis Island, the immigration officer did not write down anything unless it was something to say there was a problem. What he wanted to do was to walk you through that line that's your name and say, is this your name? You know, are you from this? You know, he would confirm all this information. But the information was written down by a ship's officer for the steamship line. And this, in fact, is a very typical ship of the time. This is, by the way, the specific one they came over on, the SS Maine. And if you haven't had the pleasure, if you were to trace your family through the Ellis Island records, you can, on the Ellis Island website, find pictures of all the ships. So you can come away with a picture of the ship that your ancestor came across in. So the facilities were crowded. Okay, this would be fairly typical kind of look.
Oh my God.
Okay, this is a schematic. Okay, but these were actually very good accommodations. The food was fairly good. Think about it. I'm taking you across, you paid. I don't want to take you back. Okay, that means that I want to keep you healthy while you're going across. This would be your dining facilities. This would be your washroom. Obviously, the gents and the ladies had separate washrooms. So this is the open area on the boat for steerage passengers. A little crowded, but you could get out on the boat if you wanted to. So the first thing almost all immigrants saw as they came to New York City was Coney Island. because you arrived into the area at night, and so you could see the lights of Coney Island. However, what everybody remembers is the Statue of Liberty. So once you arrived, as you got off, this is steerage passengers, you received a card that was attached to some piece of clothing, and this was critical. The card was a way in which they kept track of who you were, and on the card was the information that matched the manifest. So your card would have the number of the page of the manifest and what line you were on that. You see the logic behind that? That allows the immigration officers to see people in their right order, and we'll talk about that more later. And you took your baggage. And you went to Ellis Island because you actually arrived over in Hoboken in New Jersey, and then you take this little boat over to Ellis Island. You drop your baggage, not your valuables, but your baggage in they had a baggage claim area that was reportedly very well protected. And then you face the stairs. So the critical thing that they tried to deal with at Ellis Island was to make sure people were healthy. So they were trying to reject people who had any significant health problem. The stairs were not random. At the top of the stairs would be a couple of immigration officers who would watch people coming up the stairs. If they had trouble breathing, etc., they would get a chalk mark. The chalk mark didn't necessarily mean that you would not be able to get into the country, but it meant that you then had to go through a secondary medical examination in some detail to make sure you were actually healthy enough to come in. These are some of the chalk marks that were reported. And again, the idea was to move people through quickly. Okay, on the day that the Isidore's wife and brother showed up, 5,400 immigrants processed through Ellis Island. And that was actually a typical day. That was not that unusual. The one exam that became truly devastating was an exam, gotta get, a second. Trachoma. Trachoma is a disease of the eye that is transmittable, and you always go blind at this point in life in medicine. So if you had trachoma, you were rejected, period, out of hand. And they would take literally a small paperclip kind of device, hold up your eyelid and look in your eye. Okay. Men and women were separated. They were inspected in detail. For men, this was kind of like a normalish thing. But think about this for women. Most European women, these are people from, many cases, rural Italy, rural Eastern Europe, had lived a life where nobody ever saw their naked body except their family and their husband. Okay, and they had to strip down and be tested. Okay, Bonnie, this is not unlikely where your great-grandmother, Bonnie's great-grandmother, 2 times great-grandmother, yeah, was actually a OBGYN doctor at Ellis Island. So she probably was a supervising available to come in and look at folks. So if you pass that, You then went into the big hall. So I want you to think about the little cubicles that people are in. You see people are in little cubicles? Would it surprise you to learn that what those cubicles are is each one of them is a page in the manifest, and people are seated in the numerical order that their name comes up on the manifest. So when your page comes up, an officer comes to your area and says, okay, time for all of you to line up. And meanwhile, there's an immigration officer who's looking at that sheet of paper. Okay. He's not, rummaging through different pieces of paper. He's moving people through. 5 minutes would be a long time. So this would be the immigration officer. This is another example. They had many translators available. If a person came up who had a linguistic limitation, they only spoke Polish or Russian or whatever, they would bring a translator over. So there was never any question that the person was able to understand what in fact was being asked. After you successfully got through that process, there was another floor you went to where they did money exchange. You remember our prior discussion about in the old days, money was something you could be cheated on. This was an honest exchange. You could turn your piece of paper into a real ticket. After all, if you had to go from New York City to Lynn, Massachusetts, you needed a ticket on the train. And they had a place where you could have a meal. And these were reportedly some of the best meals immigrants ever remembered. And back to the stairs. And here, I don't know which side would have been which. One side were the people who were chalk marked, and the other were the people who could just move on now. Only about 2% of the people who hit Ellis Island were eventually rejected. The rejections were mostly in Europe, not there. So these are the people lining up to get on the ferry boat to take them over to the city. They would end up at Penn Station.
Oh.
The thing was so organized that there were paid employees of the Immigration Service who would meet immigrants at the ferry location at Battery Park and escort them to whichever station they had to go to. So they were just not going to be left alone as they had to go to Penn Station, waiting for the train. And then they ended up at the new terminal station in Boston, took the local Lynn train out to that area. There was a little ferry that took them over to it. This is now the Blue Line, for those who know Boston. And they end up here in America, in the tenements, building a family. Okay, a couple of diversions. This is a picture of a bunch of Eastern European, Polish, probably, women. Note the cards. Jewish men. If you were Jewish, things got a lot dicier. There were two reasons. If you were leaving Eastern Europe, you were typically poorer than the average non-Jewish immigrant. And therefore, you did not necessarily have as much money. You had to be making your way across. And that became a problem when you got to the border. And Jewish men had special requirements for military service. All immigrant men had to prove that they had served some minimum time in the military that was acceptable, but Jewish men could be quite long. So it was quite a problem potentially for them. And this is a favorite picture of mine. These are the Irish washerwomen. Okay, they were a special class. Almost always came over. There was I've read reports of, depending on what village area you were from, when you ended up in Boston, there was a place you were told to go, and that's where other people were from your village or from around there, and you could stay there until you found a place of your own. And then there are the Italians. When you get to the Italians, you have an interesting change. With the Jewish who immigrated, very few ever went back. Immigration is push or pull. Push is when your current conditions are so bad that anything's better. Pull is when you really are attracted to the alternative that you're immigrating to. Okay, if you were a Jewish male from Eastern Europe or a Jewish family, okay, you were leaving because things were horrible in Russia, and you were part of Russia. If you were regular Polish, about 15-20% went back. There's an interesting story in Marie's family about that, because one of the people from Marie's grandmother's tiny village was someone who had immigrated to the US and then immigrated back, moved back. By the time you get to Italy, people from southern Italy, it would not be unusual 40-50% of those people to go home. They came to the United States to earn money. Okay, you could take that, think about what we said about how much you could earn per week. They would earn money, take it home, use that as their grub stake for setting up a family. So immigration was a business. It was a big business. Most immigrants had their way paid. Chain migration, few immigrants without a clear destination. Now, one thing to add is this all stopped in the early 1920s. In the early 1920s, two things happened. One was we had the anti-immigrant emotion, not dissimilar from what we have today, and they passed a set of laws which limited migration to a ratio of the people who lived in the United States in 1890 by country. So if you think about 1890, a lot of those Italians and Polish, and they weren't here. So the limitations on immigration were pretty severe, unless you were from England, Germany, or Scandinavia. This is a graphic of the number of people who came in. What this doesn't show is roughly 1 million people came in from Mexico during the 1892 to 1924 period. And about 1 million people came in from Canada. That's because a number of the European immigrants came to Canada first. And some of it was they felt that it was easier to bypass the immigration limitations and do what they wanted to if they came in through Canada. So they were headed for the US. Okay, questions? If somebody can grab the microphone, pass it around, because we've got a few people. If you've got any questions, if you're online, just unmute yourself and give me the question. Oh, you're doing microphone duty? Okay. No questions at all? Okay, here we go.
My question is about the thing you wrote where nobody had their name changed. And I'm wondering if there was some other time when a person came in that they had to do something with a judge who might have changed their name. I know in my family, we have a long story that the name was changed. And also, when I tell people that, they tell me similarly that the name had to be changed. So I was surprised to hear you say that.
Well, when I'm saying it wasn't changed at Ellis Island, that's a mechanical answer. When the person came to the Bremenhaven steamship company, okay, there would be an officer who would fill out that line on, okay, and to use an example, that you might have an officer who could handle Russian, but not Yiddish. Okay, so the person who came up was Jewish, okay, and was speaking Yiddish, and so the guy wrote down what he best could figure out. And if you've not done it, it's always fun to take the long version of your family name and go on to there are a couple of websites that will do this. Go on and have them pronounce it in the original language. So have the language, have it pronounced in Polish or have it pronounced in Russian. And what you'll find is it's not unusual that it sounds a lot different than you think it will. Then the pronunciation also became an issue with regard to census records, with regard to, so for a lot of people, they changed the name because it was a lot easier. Marie's grandmother's maiden name was Barzakowska, and her brother came over, and for years we were looking for his family and had trouble because he came over as Barzakowski and his kids all grew up as Bard. You know, a lot easier to go down to the local store and say, our local. So a lot of reasons for people changing their names, but the specific, because of the mechanics of it, it was very rare they were changed at Ellis Island. Other questions or comments?
George, can you comment at all about Castle Garden and how it was different than Ellis Island?
It did not have the full range of examination and examination officers. At that point, it was customs officers. So their predominant job was in terms of managing materials and the possibility of smuggling and things, but it was not the immigrants. They were not trained to deal with immigrants. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
My grandmother came over with her mother, and they're traveling to meet my great-grandfather. But they get bounced from Ellis Island because it's just the two of them, and they're sent to Castle Garden before being released. Can you tell me a little bit about why that might have been?
Yes. Basically, unaccompanied women were had to have a man show up to pick them up. And the reason was because they did not want to run the risk that they were releasing women who might be turned into commercial property. Okay. And there were exceptions if you, so for example, think about Marie's grandfather's brother and his wife. You know, that was a woman with a man. So no problem, they moved on through. But single women, it was a fairly big issue. If you had a through ticket, they would often let you go on through. But if otherwise, if you had no through ticket and you were a single woman, most of the time they held you until a male would show up to pick you up.
I'm looking at your slide that's up now, and what years do all these numbers cover?
1892 to 1924.
Thank you.
Okay. Again, less the 2 million that came across the north and south borders. What I find interesting in this was that for all of the knowledge we have of the people who came from Russia and Poland, awful lot of folks came from Italy. And of course, Austria-Hungary included portions of Poland. So Poland at that time sort of split up. We have a question in the front row? Okay.
Yes, but
Before this time, people just got off the boat and went wherever they wanted to. Was-
Generally.
I
yeah.
see, yes.
And as a matter of fact, if you can get manifests of ships going way back into the 1700s, okay, they're just spotty. There were very few professional records kept, and the information on them is quite limited. But that was part of the reason why they went through this, was because there was a backlash to uncontrolled immigration, as there is today. Okay. And if you think about, often when we have discussions about immigration, isn't it frequent that we will talk about the need for healthy workers who can do the jobs, like the farm, et cetera. Okay. And we know that that's needed as part of the immigration process. Okay. There was a question in the front row. Thank you, Marie.
Do you have any information about people who emigrated from Eastern Europe to Canada? You know, the numbers?
I don't personally have the numbers right here, but it would have been probably disproportionately, because we're going north to north. Okay. Higher, you would have fewer people from Italy and okay. But a lot of those people, there are good records. If you look at the records, there are fairly good records for Canada. There are spotty records for people coming from Canada into the US.
I have a question. You mentioned that in the 20s, when they started being more restrictive, that they went back to numbers that were allowed in earlier on, and that Germany was being favored. But I thought that because of World War I, we were really restricting German immigration in the 20s.
I don't believe that was true in the 20s. It obviously would have been true during the teens, when it was very difficult to immigrate for anybody. But the interesting thing in terms of the immigration after 1924, to me, was Germany and Ireland both were relatively wide open. Okay. It was Eastern Europe and the whole Mediterranean area that were quite limited. And of course, if you go back to those periods, there was a fair amount of feeling that those were inferior people, that they were other. Okay. Forgive me for it, but in 1960, I moved into a new house. My family moved into a new house. Okay. And we're told that they knew that there was an Italian family just down the street. They didn't think it would affect the house values that much. Okay.
Wow.
If I have information on a couple of relatives who've come over, but I don't see anybody else who came with them. And I don't see that they went to a place where people were already in New York City mostly. What's the best way for me to try to figure out if somebody came with them, if somebody paid for their transit, or?
Well, but during this period, the manifest has a column that is who paid for this.
Okay.
Okay. It also has a column that says, where are you going? So when Marie's grandmother's brother came over, his manifest record says, I am going to be with Veronica Bardzikowska, who lives at such and such, in Providence, Rhode Island. Okay. Talk about great genealogical information. Okay. The other two places to look, first of all, look throughout them. If you can find somebody who came over on a particular ship, skim up and down the listings on that ship for people who may have come from the same village. Okay. All right. And for those who haven't rummaged in this area a lot, stevemorse.org is the go-to website for this. Okay. He's done a massive job of organizing the immigration records so you can access them directly and you can actually search for the village. If you know what village someone came from, you can search for who else came from this village. Okay, weird as that is. Also, when you find someone in the first census or city directory, okay, and city directories is a great place to look. So I came over in 1901. I'm looking at the 1903 city directory. I know a street address. Who else is at that street address? Okay, or nearby. Okay, other questions? Sue, how could we have a meeting without Sue having a question?
So I don't see anything about the British Isles coming in to the Ellis Island. Were they coming in prior to Ellis Island's opening? But there's nothing up there that represents.
Very, very few came from Britain during this period.
Oh, during this period. And would you say the
But-
period again, please?
This is 1891,
Okay.
1924.
All right.
Okay.
Mine were already here.
Let's also mention this was at least the start of it was still the heyday of Britain as the dominant country in the world. We were still the poor cousins.
I do know that my grandfather and his sister were paying for relatives from the island of Pico and the Azores in Portugal in the early 50s to bring a family over, in particular with 3 children, because the volcano there had erupted the year before, and it covered all their agricultural ground, that they all had their own food from home that they grew. Now they couldn't do that. They couldn't go to work, couldn't do anything. And so they were collecting clothes from all of us and sending the clothes over to them prior to them getting them over here. And they came through Canada.
Okay. Well, again, if you follow the bouncing ball called American immigration, Canada has been a more stable place in terms of the rules and how willing they were to take people in. Great question.
What's the longest amount of time someone would have been detained on Ellis Island?
Longest is always a complicated term. If you came over and you had a short-term illness, they would have kept you on Ellis Island until you were well. And that might have been weeks. It wouldn't have been months. Okay. Although maybe if Bonnie does her homework, we can find out more of the truth of that. I would suspect there were also situations, going back to the comment about women, also situations where women were kept longer because of the concern about proper treatment of women and all the rest. Okay. Men, hey, okay, you got a cold. Heck with you.
And then women were also kept if their children were ill.
Yes.
And if the children were ill enough to be sent back, mom had to go too.
Yeah, that was one of the really terrifying things for those few who did have to deal with it. If the person who was sent back was underage, a member of the family had to go back with them. Okay. Which was pretty devastating. Yeah.
Other side of the family. The grandfather goes to South America first. It looks like it's Argentina, but then he comes up to the US. Argentina to the US, do you know anything about how they might have traveled? I've checked New Orleans, I've checked Baltimore. I can't seem to find where he enters.
I have no idea. I will comment that remember that about 1 million people came in across the Mexican border. Okay, and my guess is the Mexican border was a pretty fluid place as it is today. Okay, so that may have been a possible. Okay, well, thank you, everybody. Oh,
I have a question. Suppose My grandmother, instead of coming from a little rural village in Poland, had come from a wealthy family in Warsaw. And they had a ton of money, but she wanted to immigrate to the United States. And so they paid for first class. Would she still have to go through Ellis Island?
Well, the short answer is no. First and second class passengers got off at Hoboken. They were waved through. There was a minimal, okay, if you go to the manifests, the manifest pages delineate first and second class separately from steerage. Okay, so you would have gotten off, or your ancestor would have gotten off, been on the list of the 10 people who were first class. Okay, because those were the numbers. The numbers were, 1,500 people in steerage and 100 people in first and second class. Okay, if that many. But they got off, they got waved through. If there was a truly obvious problem, they might be held aside, but probably not.
Can you give us some of the best sources, online sources you've used to, one can use for tracing genealogy for immigrants that came across in this period?
Yeah, that's Steve Morse, M-O-R-S-E,
MRSE?
M-O-R-S-E, Morse,
Okay.
.org. Okay.
Okay.
He and another gentleman, Joel Weintraub, have put together two things that are really fascinating to work. They have the linkages. By the way, this goes well beyond the Ellis Island period. They have the best linkages to the Canadian data. They have the best linkages to New Orleans data, all of that, and from earlier data. But they've also, Weintraub, one of his expertises has been helping the computer figure out alternative names. So if you know your family's name, but you aren't quite sure what would have shown up on the manifest, okay? There are misspellings, there's there's also just, you can't read the handwriting problems. The transcriber has a problem, okay? So he's done a marvelous job of giving alternative versions of the name. And you, as I said before, one comment, you can search that database by the village if you want to. So that is far and away the best database.
What about the shipping company manifests? Are those
Yes,
accessible online?
they're both Bremenhaven and Hamburg have online manifests from their end of the people who got on the ships. And they're different, and therefore they do provide some different information that can be useful.
And what about Ellis Island records directly? Are those online?
Well, what happens if you use the Steve Morse site?
Yep.
It has the best way of indexing what's on the Ellis Island site, and then it links you to the actual manifest, which is on the Ellis Island site. So you can open up the manifest and look at it. It doesn't cost any money to use Steve's site, and you do have to sign up for an Ellis Island account, which doesn't cost any money, although they are desperately asking for people to voluntarily give us money. Because the link that will happen. Okay. Now, there are a couple other locations. If you have a Jewish background or are from Eastern Europe, generally, the website Jewish Gen, Jewish Gen, that website has a lot of interesting information that helps link. And there are more and more databases on what original information is in Europe, which can be very helpful. One of the things Jewish Gen can help you with is if you look at the manifest and it says this person is from the village of, okay, where did you come from? It helps you understand what's the likely alternative names for that village. Because obviously what got written on the manifest may or may not be quite what it was. Okay. One more?
I have my father's immigration sheet, and I was wondering if the people would be interested in the questions that had to be answered on the immigration sheet.
If they are, it's
Well,
wonderful.
I mean, if this group is interested in the questions. Okay, name in full. My father came with his mother, Marie Larson, Larson. When they came to the United States, it was Larson, so the name did change. My father's name is listed as Ludwig, Ludvig. And all his life, he was known as Lewis. So I don't know when that change came. Anyway, the year and month of their age, their sex, married or single, their calling or occupation. My grandmother's name was not listed as anything, but some people were listed as laborer and servant. Able to read and write, and almost all of them were marked, yes, they could. Nationality, this boat sailed from Liverpool in 1899. The last residence where they were living. It's been rolled up a long time. Their seaport for landing, and it was New York. Final destination, and there's all different names listed. My grandmother was coming to Cleveland, Illinois. Who paid for the trip? And it said her husband, George, who was already here. Have you been invited to stay with someone? The answer is yes or no. Were you ever in the United States before? Whether going to join a relative, and if so, what relation is that person? How much money did you have? It looks to me like she had $25. Some people had $12. One person had $135. Another person had $6. Another person had $6. Whether or not they were a polygamist, if you can imagine. Conditions of health, mental and physical. Is he deformed or crippled, and so on. And my father always had a slight limp. And on this paper, he was 9 years old at the time, and it says slightly lame, left leg. But it didn't make him go back.
Thank you. If you haven't ever seen one of those, they're very large, and in the original documents are very large. In addition to the polygamous question, a question that got added to the list was, "Are you an anarchist?" And I've always sort of imagined, like someone coming to the Ellis Island, and when the questioner asks them, "Are you an anarchist?" says, "Oh yes, I'm an." The way paid question is interesting because you were not allowed to have your way paid by a corporation. In other words, a corporation couldn't go to Europe and recruit people and then pay them to come over. That was explicitly not allowed. And $5, I believe it was $5, was the least amount of money you had to have. You had to have money, okay? And I think it was $5 was the minimum.
One thing I always wondered was the father was in a town called Leland, Illinois, and the ship was in New York. And I always wondered whether he went to New York or they got the wife and the two children got on the train or something. I don't know, and got to Illinois. I don't know. I never heard that story. I'm sorry to say.
It would be more likely that he would have gone to New York. That would have been more likely, okay? Because women and children at that immigrant, particularly at that stage, would not have been considered safe traveling on their own. Too many ways people could take advantage of them. And if you were going to Illinois, by the way, you traveled out of Newark. You didn't go through New York City. More people left from Newark than actually left from New York when they were transiting. Because anyway, if you're going anywhere west, that's where you left from. Okay, one more shot.
I have another question.
Yeah.
When did they start requiring visas and passports?
That was part of the 1924 follow-on. I think it was 1929 when they moved to beginning in 24, it shifted so that more of the stuff had to be done in the home country and less in the US. Okay. And that's when in that period, there's about a 5-year period of transition. That's when they ended up in a visa system that said, we're going to let in so many people. The numbers, if I remember correctly, the allowed number from Japan was like 100. Okay. It was insane. But okay, we're going to try something a little different next month. I'm going to ask everyone who comes, if they can, to think of a grandmother or great grandfather, grandmother, or great grandfather, grandmother, who they think had a particularly interesting event in their life or interesting aspect of their life, and share with us for about 5 minutes about that. And I'll send out notes on this. I'd love to have a picture if you have one. Okay. But recently had a conversation with a member of the club who was just absolutely taken with some events in the grandmother's life. And I thought that would be interesting for us all to think about. Thank you much, Lee. Have a great Memorial Day.